Welcome back to the Race Report podcast. We are on episode 4 right now, and we have just completed pre-season test 2 in Bahrain, and we are days away from our first race of the season. I cannot wait. Let's get stuck straight in. Let's start with that pre-season test that I just mentioned. We just had pre-season test 2 in Bahrain, and it was a chance for the teams to work on their upgrades, see how the changes they made from the last test affected the car in this test, and overall, I think they pushed the cars a lot harder this time. We saw a lot more failures overall than we did in the first test, where I think they were just kind of getting up to speed, checking the aero quite a bit. So, how did each of the teams do? Let's do a bit of a rundown, eh? We'll start off with Ferrari, who were no doubt the winners of the previous test. In this test as well, they were once again strong and reliable. Most people are now pointing at them as the favourite. That is even in amongst the teams, with both Red Bull and Mercedes saying, hey, Ferrari is strong, man. We should look out for them. Overall, they had a great lap count and brilliant times on the results sheet as well. Of course, timings don't matter too much, so we shouldn't read into that too much, but it's always nice to have, right? McLaren were another team that had a very strong test 1. However, they came into this test and it didn't go well for them at all, to be honest. They had brake temperature issues from the very beginning, and that looks pretty significant for them. They were only allowed to do short runs because their brakes were just overheat. They couldn't do any long runs at all. At this point in time, they don't know if they can get that fixed for the first race in Bahrain, which is a real worry for them. Another worry is the status of Daniel Ricciardo. He tested positive over the weekend. I was not able to drive at all in the car over the second test. Obviously, we do hope he gets better. It is said that he is feeling much better now, so that's great news. But of course, he's missed out a lot of running in that car. And now it is a race against time to see if he can test negative again before the first race in Bahrain. He's got plenty of time, so it should be doable, but fingers crossed anyway. Over at Mercedes, they were the talk of the town coming to this test. They made a huge change to their chassis, effectively eliminating their side pod. It was all anybody could talk about, especially on the first day of testing, because it is such a radical design that they've gone for. Ross Brawn, head of F1's technical element, did say that this is something that the F1 team, when designing these rules, did not account for. So he was going to take a very, very good look at this to see if any rules were being broken or whether it was, all played fair, basically. No suggestion that it didn't, but he was keeping an eye on it. Somebody who did make a suggestion that it didn't play fair was Christian Horner. On the first day, he came out and was quoted of saying, that's illegal. But then, curiously, a couple hours later, he was quoted of saying, I never said that, I haven't looked at it. And then, a couple days later, he was quoted of saying, oh, it all looks perfectly legal. It's a bit weird, isn't it? Overall, they actually had a pretty poor test period, considering the changes they'd made. Obviously, with this radical design, you would have expected much greater wins coming out of the test. That's not what we got. And even Hamilton himself came out and said the team do not expect to be fighting for wins early on in the season. They're going to have to work on it. Now, we could take that as gospel. Mercedes aren't going to be near the top. But also, let's take it with a pinch of salt, right? Because they're trying to set expectations as low as possible. They've done this in the past as well. So, we'll see. We'll see come the start of the season very shortly, hey? But Mercedes weren't the only ones to turn up with new side pods, essentially. Red Bull turned up on the final day with their new side pod design, sculpting their already aggressive look. And they had the opposite of Mercedes. Their car was strong and consistent throughout, and they were the ones that walked away with the fastest times overall. They do look like the team to beat, certainly right now, and we'll see how they get on very, very shortly. Over at Alpine, they did have a few issues. They also ran their pink livery. Again, I keep thinking that's the Racing Point or a Force India, but there it is. It's the Alpine. They did have a few niggling little issues, but they got over it, and they had better running overall with some decent times as well. Certainly better than the first test. They'll be much more happy with this one. At AlphaTauri, they were steady and reliable once again, just like the first test. They're the second highest lap count and dead center in the middle of the road of the times. So they're just putting in the mileage and making sure everything works. And that's exactly what you want from these tests. Not blowing anyone away, but certainly not near the bottom either. Aston Martin were also around the middle of the road lap count. However, they did have the second slowest lap overall, but they stayed out of trouble for the most part. Of course, the timing screens don't mean everything. They might have been going for like long runs, heavy on fuel, etc, etc. So I'm sure they'll be happy with the amount of laps they got in. Hopefully plenty of data for them as well. Haas started off the weekend extremely poorly. They had a freight issue, which meant they got to the test late. They missed a whole morning, essentially. But they did get given a little extra time at the end of the day and in the morning to make up for it. They also had to introduce a new driver to the car. Very quick seat fitting, and he's in. It's Kevin Magnussen. He's back, and he managed to set a cheeky fastest time on day 2 as well. Now, that seems to be the epitome of the time screens don't matter. The fact that a fella that hasn't raced in over a year can just sit in the car and do a fastest lap. But I must admit, I was very happy to see it. Haas do feel like a real underdog right now. I'm willing to get behind them for that reason, to be honest. Alfa Romeo still had multiple issues throughout this test, meaning that both tests were disrupted for them. Their mileage wasn't great at either test, and that's going to be extremely, extremely disappointing for them. They are far down the field right now, and we don't really know where they sit in terms of speed. Their car could be amazing, but because they've not had the time out on track for us to get to see it enough, we don't really know. So, no real data on them right now. Williams had a pretty spectacular fire on the rear brakes, which melted away their suspension. You might have seen the pictures of Latifi acting as firefighter as well, which I thought was pretty cool. Of course, that affected their total lap count as it cost them more or less a whole day of testing. But even when they were banging in the laps, they didn't look particularly fast. But again, they could just be concentrating on that long running. Maybe that day they missed was the day they were going to do the short runs and the fast ones and stuff like that. So who knows? But hopefully it won't affect them too badly overall. One curious thing I saw throughout the entire grid, once again, was porpoising. I was very confused and curious about why this is still a problem. Of course, we saw it in Test 1 in Barcelona, and I assumed that the teams would go away and have that fixed for Test 2. I thought it'd be one of their higher priority issues. That was not the case. Some teams suffered more than others. I saw Mercedes suffering it quite badly. But yeah, it's interesting to see if that'll be affecting teams come the actual races, because that bouncing over the course of a 2-hour race, that's going to potentially wreck the underfloor of your car. So another one to look out for there. Overall, because it had so little testing time, I do think it is still hard to pick out who the standouts are. Coming off the back of Test 2 now, as well as the Test 1 data, it does look like Red Bull, Ferrari are out in front of the field right now. But we'll see how things shake up. Like we've seen Mercedes had bad testing before. If you've just been watching Drive to Survive, you know how badly they suffered in testing, but still walked away with a win at the first race. So perhaps we'll see that again. Don't count them out. After all, they are the Constructors' Champions and have been for the longest time in history. So we'll see where they are when the points are doled out on Sunday. Now, let's look at the other news, shall we? We kind of touched on it a little bit there, but we do have Kevin Magnussen back at Haas. Let's dive into that a little bit. So we knew last week that Haas had dropped Nikita Mazepin from his seat. However, we were speculating on who could take that seat at that stage. Names bandied about like Alpine's Oscar Piastri, Nico Hülkenberg, and others were mentioned. But it actually goes back to the old head of Kevin Magnussen being pulled back into the sport. Not for the first time. This is actually the second time he spent a year out and come back. He was away in America racing in sports cars, but they did let him come back. Like, they didn't have to. There was no clause in his contract to say that he could re-enter F1 at any stage. But they felt like this was the best for the driver, so they did it off their own back. So fair play to, I think it was Peugeot that he was racing for out there. So fair play to them. That was a good guy move. And it means Magnussen flew straight to Bahrain and got stuck straight into the testing. I think the first day he was just getting acquainted with everything, getting his seat fitting. Then he did manage to actually get some runs in the car as well. Like I said, he managed to actually get the fastest time on one of the days, which, I just loved that. I loved that that can happen. So that was brilliant. Of course, when it comes to the actual racing, he'll be way down on experience. Like, those couple of days are the first days he's spent with the team in a year. And he's had no experience of these cars, no experience of the team even for a little while now. So he's got to get his head around that incredibly quickly. It was also announced that this deal with Magnussen is a multi-year deal. So he won't just be around for this year. He's not some stopgap until they find somebody better. He is their driver for multiple years to come. And I think he's only like 29, so actually makes a lot of sense for him. And it means Haas get a popular figure at the team. He was very popular there, so he boosts their morale a little bit. And they get an experienced head to sit in the new car, which is something you could argue that they didn't have. It's also going to be great for Mick Schumacher, I think, not only because he'll get the experience to build from and take from Magnussen, but he also gets a bit of a benchmark, which I don't think he really got last season. I mean, Haas was so terrible that they were only really racing each other. And when it's Schumacher against Mazepin, there was only going to be one winner there. So I don't think we really got to see how he was doing. So now he's got a real benchmark to go against. It'll be interesting to see how he gets on as well. And speaking of the internal workings of Haas, we did get the Netflix Drive to Survive drop late last week. So that's now available. I've watched a few episodes so far, still going through them. But the Haas episode where Dmitry Mazepin threatened to pull funding unless they changed Nikita's car. Ugh, that felt so gross to me. And I'm really surprised that that's something I didn't know that happened during that time. So that's crazy. I love finding those little tidbits, behind the scenes nuggets in the Drive to Survive series. That's what it's all about for me. Like, you can keep the drama and stuff like that. It's, it is what it is. They've got to make a TV show. But yeah, it's those kind of like little hidden gems that I love to find in that series. So far, it seems pretty good. I am wondering if I should do a dedicated video on that, if anybody would like that, if anybody would watch that. So do drop a comment if you are interested in seeing what I think of that show. I'll do a little episode by episode breakdown. But yeah, give me a shout if that's something you'd be looking forward to, and I can get that done. Over in other news, there's not been too much this week because obviously the test has gone down. That's what everybody's been talking about. But we did have the F1 2022 Manager video game announced, which is a new video game that puts you in the shoes of a team principal. It's being developed by a company called Frontier rather than Codemasters, but we'll still be getting the Codemasters title, so one you're a racer, one you're a team principal is how it shapes up. No gameplay of it yet, but good to know it is coming this year. And one tiny gem we had from commentary during the testing was the Sky Sports commentators effectively confirming a third US race. Now, it wasn't clear if that's going to be for this year, replacing Russia, or if that's going to be years down the line. Good to get that confirmation, I guess. It's from a weird source, the commentators doing that. But hopefully, in the next couple of days, we will hear something concrete. And that's it. That's all the news and reviews this week. I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments and you're on YouTube, feel free to put them in the YouTube comment section. If you're an audio listener, feel free to hit me up at Race Report Pod on Twitter or Instagram, and I can include them in the show. Thanks very much for listening, everybody, and I'll catch you in the next one.